They laughed. God, they laughed like hyenas tearing at my dignity, in that sterile conference room, under those fluorescent lights that made my humiliation feel clinical, almost scientific. They called my invention a child's fantasy, a garage gimmick. I remember every smirk, every patronizing nod. And I remember the moment I swore that when they finally realized what I had built, it would already be too late to stop me. Before we dive into the story, tell me in the comments which country you're watching this from. I love seeing how far these stories travel, and it helps me connect with you all around the world. My name is Elias Rowan, and for most of my life, I believed equations could protect me. Numbers were pure, immune to politics, greed, and ego. I thought if my math was flawless, my work would speak for itself. I was wrong. Helix Dynamics was the kind of company that wrapped itself in words like innovation and sustainability, but underneath the slogans, it was a graveyard for idealists. I joined them as a mechanical engineer, fresh out of graduate research, hungry to prove that my design for a self-sustaining micro-reactor could change how the world thought about energy. The reactor was small enough to fit inside a suitcase, no fossil fuels, no emissions, and nearly limitless efficiency. I built the prototype with my own hands in a rented storage unit, working nights and weekends while my superiors smiled and took notes they didn't deserve to take. Then came the meeting. A long, glass table. Suits on every side. I stood there, heart pounding, as I connected the prototype and watched it hum to life. The readings were perfect. Stable. Beyond expectations. And yet when I looked up, they weren't looking at the data, they were looking at me, measuring how easy I'd be to control. Impressive, said Victor Hale, Helix's CEO, with that wolfish grin that always meant he was already thinking about ownership. But you're still a junior engineer, Elias. We'll need to review your materials before taking this any further. I didn't sleep that night. Somewhere between exhaustion and adrenaline, I told myself to trust them. To believe that corporate ambition and human decency could coexist. Weeks passed. Then months. Every request for updates went unanswered. One morning, I was locked out of my lab credentials. My emails bounced. Security escorted me out like a thief. 2 days later, Helix announced their new revolutionary prototype, the Helion engine, a compact energy reactor developed by Helix's in-house team. My design. My data. My equations. Even my wiring pattern, the asymmetrical node I'd created to stabilize thermal feedback, all of it was there, hidden under a different name. I remember standing in the rain outside their building, the announcement playing on a massive digital screen above the lobby. My name was nowhere. Victor Hale's was everywhere. I tried to fight back. I filed a complaint. I called lawyers. But Helix had already filed the patent under their name, 4 months before I was locked out. They had rewritten history with signatures and timestamps, erasing me as if I had never existed. When I went public, they buried me. Articles called me a disgruntled ex-employee. Helix issued statements about security breaches and confidential intellectual property. Within a week, I was blacklisted from every major tech firm on the coast. I lost my job, my apartment, my reputation, everything except one thing, the knowledge that they hadn't understood my full design. The Helion engine they stole was incomplete. The final module, the stabilizer that prevented meltdown, was still mine, locked inside my head. And one day, I promised myself as I slept in my car behind a gas station, they would pay for stealing the heart of my invention. They took my name from the blueprint. So I'd carve my name into their downfall. The first time I saw the patent, my hands went cold before my eyes could even focus. It was a PDF, public record, stamped with the elegance of an execution order. US 10, 998,432, compact thermal feedback energy system. Inventors listed, Victor Hale and 3 senior engineers who once asked me how to spell ferrofluid. My name did appear, in the citations, in the footnotes, a ghost haunting the margins of my own work. I scrolled through diagrams I'd drawn at 3 a.m. on coffee-stained paper. My asymmetrical node. My dual-loop coolant path. Even the idiosyncratic labeling I used when I was too tired to be neat. They hadn't improved it, they'd embalmed it. A cathedral built on a stolen foundation. I hired a lawyer using money I didn't have. Marla Keene wore blunt suits and spoke like a scalpel. She studied the patent, then looked at me with the kind of pity surgeons save for a patient who waited too long. They filed provisionals months ago, she said. Backdated lab notebooks, meeting minutes, email threads. They made a paper world where you never existed. I have the original notebooks, I told her. Handwritten. Dated. They'll claim you developed them here, on company time, under their IP policy. We can fight, Elias, but they have an army and a budget line for burying people. We tried anyway. We filed an inventorship challenge. Helix responded with a cease and desist that read like scripture, accusations of misappropriating trade secrets, accessing systems without authorization, even implying I'd sabotaged equipment. They used the word rogue like it was my middle name. The blacklisting wasn't a conspiracy so much as a choreography. Recruiters stopped replying. Former colleagues ghosted me. The few who took my calls spoke in hushed voices from parking garages. Look, I believe you, but legal told us, click. My bank balance began its steady descent toward zero. I sold furniture, then books, then my watch, a graduation gift from my mother, to pay for filing fees I couldn't pronounce. One afternoon, I walked into the Helix lobby with a manila envelope and the worst idea of my life: ask for a meeting. The receptionist smiled the way you smile at a stray dog that might bite. Security arrived before I could open my mouth. I begged for 10 minutes with hail. I got 10 seconds of humiliation as the guards escorted me out while a junior analyst filmed from behind a latte and a smirk. That clip would later surface on a gossip blog under the caption, "When your ex-employee wants clout." Marla called that night. They offered a settlement, she said. Confidential. Small. How small? Small enough to insult you, large enough to make you think about food and rent. And the condition? You sign a statement conceding inventorship. You admit the reactor is theirs. I didn't answer. She didn't push. People like Marla understand that some decisions are made in the marrow. I stared at the settlement document until dawn. It promised safety wrapped in surrender. It tasted like ash. I turned it down. That's when Helix shifted from erasure to annihilation. They filed an injunction to bar me from working on substantially similar systems. The wording was a scalpel aimed at my future. If granted, I wouldn't just lose a job, I'd lose a field, a lifetime of study, the language my hands knew how to speak. The hearing took 9 minutes. The judge glanced at the stack of exhibits Helix's counsel wheeled in like a wedding cake and granted a temporary order. My chest felt hollow, a house with the walls torn out. Afterward, outside the courthouse, it started to rain, the kind of thin, relentless drizzle that doesn't cleanse so much as remind you you're not worth a storm. I parked behind a gas station that night and opened my trunk. Inside, 2 notebooks, a soldering kit, a cracked multimeter, 3 coils of copper wire, and a pill bottle of screws. It looked pathetic, until I remembered what Helix hadn't understood. The patent they filed was a snapshot, not the living organism. They had copied the what. They had no idea about the why. The stabilizer wasn't a part, it was a philosophy. A way of listening to heat as if it were language. In my head, algorithms bent like reeds in the wind. Vectors nested inside vectors until feedback sang in harmony. I saw it as clearly as a constellation, a control method invisible on paper, obvious in behavior. Unpatentable, because it lived in the hands of the person who built it. That night, under buzzing fluorescence and the smell of diesel, I drafted a new blueprint. No Helix fingerprints. Cleaner geometry. Fewer moving parts. A ghost design that would never match their claims in court yet would outperform every counterfeit they could manufacture. I sketched until the page turned gray with graphite and resolve. At dawn, I made a list. Not of enemies, of dependencies. Suppliers who owed favors. A community college machine shop with a foreman who used to fix radios for fun. A storage unit whose manager accepted cash and questions in equal measure. I blocked my number, shaved my beard, changed my email, and shed my name like a snakeskin. Helix owned the record. I would own the result. They had stolen my invention with signatures, I would steal their future with silence. The patent was a fortress. Good. Fortresses have gates. Gates have hinges. Hinges rust. And rust, if you know where to look, starts from the inside. The human mind breaks quietly. Not in screams or shattering glass, but in small, invisible ways, like code failing silently in the background while the system still runs. I didn't realize I'd broken until the 3rd week of sleeping in my car. Days bled into each other, caffeine for breakfast, rain for dinner. I showered at a gym that didn't check membership IDs. My laptop battery became my heartbeat. Every time I opened it, I stared at the blueprint of the stolen reactor, the one I'd designed with joy before it became evidence of my own naivety. But rock bottom has a strange property. It strips away illusions until all that's left is truth and hunger. And hunger, especially the kind laced with humiliation, can be pure fuel. I stopped trying to get my old life back. It was gone. Instead, I started building again. I rented a small, half-forgotten storage unit on the edge of the industrial district, concrete floors, buzzing lights, air that smelled of oil and ghosts. That place became my cathedral. I laid out my tools, the ones Helix hadn't confiscated because they didn't know they existed: a rusted soldering iron, 2 portable batteries, and a chipped oscilloscope. The first nights were chaos. Circuits failed, solder dripped, and my fingers blistered. But through exhaustion, something new began to form, not a copy of the stolen design, but its evolution. I wasn't rebuilding what they took. I was creating what they could never have understood. The stabilizer, the soul of the system, was the key. Helix had dismissed it as non-essential redundancy. They didn't realize it was what made the entire reactor self-balancing, capable of converting ambient energy fluctuations into stability. In other words, infinite efficiency born from imperfection. The irony was poetic. The very flaw they ignored would become their undoing. Weeks turned into months. I lost track of time, of the world outside. My beard grew wild, my hands were perpetually cut and bandaged. But inside that storage unit, I was free, truly free, for the first time since Helix branded me as a failure. Then, one night, while tuning the magnetic containment field, it happened. The hum changed pitch. A low resonance filled the air, steady, harmonic, alive. I stepped back and watched the readout stabilize perfectly for the first time. No overheating, no fluctuation. I had done it. The perfected prototype. Compact. Silent. Stable. And best of all, untraceable. I named it Project Revenant, because like me, it had died once, and now it had come back for the living. Still, invention wasn't enough. I knew Helix's reach, their lawyers, their spies, their investors. If they suspected I was working again, they'd crush me before I surfaced, so I became a ghost in the grid. I used prepaid phones, bounced my online activity through public Wi-Fi, and paid for materials in cash. I even learned to code encryption systems to hide my notes across multiple drives, each one fragmenting my research like a puzzle only I could reassemble. One night, I caught a broadcast online. Helix Dynamics was preparing for a historic reveal. Their CEO, Victor Hale, smiled on stage beneath a screen displaying the words Helion Engine, the future of energy. They were about to unveil the incomplete version. My stolen design. I watched as the audience applauded his charisma, the same man who had stripped me of everything. I studied his face, memorizing every wrinkle of arrogance, every carefully rehearsed gesture. The crowd saw a visionary. I saw a thief with a countdown above his head. Because that night, I made my second promise. The first was to perfect my invention. The second was to use it, not for the world, not for progress, but for justice. They thought I was gone. A failed engineer. A ghost lost in obscurity. They had no idea the ghost had teeth. So I began to plan. Quietly. Meticulously. Every empire that falls does so from within, and I knew Helix's internal systems better than anyone alive. The question wasn't if I'd destroy them. It was how loud they'd scream when I did. I had been erased from their records, but I hadn't been erased from their routines. Helix breathed with habits the way a sleeping animal breathes, predictable rises and falls, the same guards on the same routes, the same interns who always left their badges on their desks. Habits are invitations. Predators read them like maps. I did not become a hacker in the movies. I learned to move like a rumor. I learned the soft art of being seen but not remembered. The courier who brought lunch to a lab that still used interns to fetch sandwiches, the maintenance contractor who replaced a faulty light on the 3rd floor, the consultant whose badge was always a little too new. I showed up where Helix's people assumed nothing of consequence happened. When you're erased, anonymity becomes armor. I built dozens of faces, empty names tied to prepaid phones, fabricated addresses, LinkedIn profiles that resemble the real thing but dissolved if scrutinized too long. I took a barista job near Helix's campus for a week and memorized the cadence of morning greetings. I smiled, learned names, and left before anyone could ask where I'd worked before. People underestimate the power of being unremarkable. Inside their systems, I found not a single cataclysmic vulnerability but a dozen small rote-en things: complacency, overconfidence, and the habit of assuming their PR shield made them invincible. I didn't need to tear down walls. I needed to open the smallest of doors and whisper a lie that felt like truth. A forwarded memo here. An innocuous sounding correction to a specification there. Paperwork that, like snow, piled until someone decided to shovel someone else's responsibility. I seeded doubt the way a gardener sows seed, not loud, not fast, but in the places that promised growth. A draft email suggesting a minor calibration change, a meeting note that misattributed a test result, a supplier invoice with a single digit shifted. Each act was tiny, legal-looking, and deniable. They prided themselves on procedures. I weaponized them. But the coldest move was the leaks. Not the dramatic kind that lands on front pages the next morning, but curated, slow drip revelations tailored to generate internal panic. I fed contrived discoveries to think pieces and anonymous forums, then let compliance and counsel take center stage. I watched as Helix executives convened emergency committees to investigate rumors I had planted, wasting time and credibility while I quietly strengthened my own position. And there was another layer: relationships. People are the messiest part of any machine, and I walked their corridors like a surgeon in a crowded hospital, attentive to heartbeat, attentive to fracture. The junior engineer who stayed late because she wanted to prove herself, the procurement officer who nursed a gambling debt, the VP who still resented being passed over for promotion. I listened. I held space. I offered help in ways that felt human and harmless. Then I watched how loyalty bent under pressure. No single action toppled Helix. The collapse I engineered was an accumulation, misalignments that multiplied under public scrutiny. When a product fails in the world does not always blame the technology, it blames the institution that promised it. I stacked evidence, nudged narratives, and let their towering confidence become a tinderbox. Still, I never forgot the difference between revenge and cruelty. I wanted justice, not slaughter. I wanted their arrogance exposed and their empire humbled, not a trail of nameless ruin. That calculus shaped every decision: reveal enough to shatter trust, withhold enough to avoid unnecessary harm. It was a moral calculus the public never asked for but the night demanded of me. One evening, weeks into the campaign, I watched a live stream of a Helix board meeting in which Victor Hale spoke with the steady confidence of a man convinced the world still needed him. He announced partnerships, pilots, a glossy future. The camera lingered on his smile as if the lens itself wanted to worship him. I took a final breath, and the whisper I had been building for months became a current. The first ripples hit the surface the next morning, anomalies flagged by auditors, a supplier withdrawing support, a headline questioning test results. Helix blinked, and for the first time since they stole my work, they looked vulnerable. That vulnerability smelled like victory. I kept my hands clean of visible fingerprints, but my hands were not empty. I had my prototype, my allies in the margins, and a hunger that tasted like iron. Revenge, I learned, is not a single strike. It's attrition, the slow bleed of certainty until your enemy no longer knows which step is safe. Helix Dynamics was a fortress built on arrogance. Every wall, every firewall, every layer of bureaucracy was designed to keep the world out. But they had forgotten that I helped build the blueprints of that fortress. I didn't need to break in. I already knew where the cracks lived. The war began quietly. I started by creating noise. Anonymous bug reports. Mysterious diagnostic inconsistencies. Firmware updates that looked like software glitches. To Helix's engineers, they were minor annoyances, but I knew those annoyances would cascade into real problems. Every reactor they built, every demo they scheduled, every investor pitch they polished depended on systems I'd touched once upon a time. Systems I could now nudge from afar. Then I attacked their confidence. Helix's investors were the kind who worshipped metrics. So I fed them false ones. Using a network of dummy shell accounts, I leaked insider data, numbers showing unstable test results, rumored regulatory audits, whispers of employee misconduct. The kind of whispers that make shareholders nervous and journalists hungry. Within weeks, Helix's stock started to flutter. The CEO called it market volatility. I called it foreplay. Meanwhile, I started selling small pieces of real innovation to competitors, under an alias, of course. Nothing connected to the Helion engine, just enough to make those competitors stronger, smarter, hungrier. Each deal was a spark in dry grass. Soon, Helix wasn't just defending its stolen invention, it was fighting for its identity. But the most satisfying part? Watching Victor Hale panic in silence. I'd obtained security footage, leaked from a contact who handled IT cleanup for Helix's internal network. In those clips, I watched Hale storm through hallways, slamming folders onto tables, barking at engineers to fix the bugs. He didn't know the bugs were my symphony, a carefully orchestrated dissonance he couldn't silence. Yet even as I savored his unraveling, I stayed invisible. My face never appeared, my name never surfaced. I became a ghost threaded through their servers, their stock reports, their press releases. Helix couldn't fight what it couldn't see. Still, every war demands resources. So I began building my own army. I reached out to an independent investor network under a fabricated name, Rex Vollen, a quiet consultant specializing in energy optimization technologies. The irony wasn't lost on me. The name became my armor. Through Rex, I sold licensing rights for non-critical patents, generating enough capital to fund what came next. What came next was precision. I purchased a derelict warehouse just outside the city limits, cash deal, no questions asked. Inside, I rebuilt Project Revenant from the ground up. The new version was refined, stripped of all identifiers. It was leaner, cleaner, and pulsed with silent menace. This was no longer an invention, it was leverage. I knew Helix would soon host their biggest event yet, a global unveiling of the commercial Helion engine. Investors from 7 countries, live coverage, $1 billion handshake. And they'd unveil my stolen idea at the center of it all. That's when the plan crystallized. I wouldn't just take their empire apart. I'd let them destroy it themselves, in front of the world. Over the next few weeks, I slipped subtle code into their testing frameworks, the kind that would pass inspection but turn catastrophic under broadcast conditions. I wasn't aiming to hurt people, just to expose the truth. I calibrated it carefully, a controlled failure, visible enough to humiliate, safe enough to avoid casualties. Every night before I slept, I read one of their press statements. Every sentence of arrogance was fuel. Every photo of Hale shaking hands with investors was another line in the script of his downfall. By the time the event was scheduled, everything was ready. The code was in place. The prototype was rigged. The audience was waiting. All I had to do was press send. I remember whispering into the dark. Let's see how much your empire is worth when the lights go out. And then, as I stared at the Helix headquarters glowing against the night sky, I smiled. Because for the first time since they'd stolen my life, I wasn't running anymore. I was hunting. They taught us growing up that patience is a virtue. They never mentioned how useful it is as a weapon. I couldn't walk back into the world as Elias Rowan. Elias had a file in legal's cabinet labeled risk. Elias had a Pinterest board of humiliations. So I invented someone else. I became Rex Volin in full costume, a polished LinkedIn profile, an accent softened by hours of practice, a consulting firm that existed mostly on paper and a rented mailbox on the nicer side of town. Rex didn't have a past anyone could subpoena. Rex had potential. Argon Industries had been Helix's polite rival for years, the kind of company that smiled for sustainability but played for market share the way a gambler plays for a table. I studied their press releases, memorized their board members' names, and found their soft spots: investor pressure for a breakthrough, a recent failed prototype their PR never wanted to talk about, and a procurement guy who liked to drink and brag. I did what any desperate engineer with principle and patience would do: I sold them salvation. Rex approached Argon with a proposal that was both modest and intoxicating. It was written in the language that seduces executives: timelines, projected efficiencies, risk mitigations, and a roadmap that cannily avoided specific proprietary links to Helix's designs. I proposed a licensing partnership for a novel thermal feedback approach, framed as an optimization, not a reinvention. It was the truth, reshaped. They wanted exclusivity. I gave them the illusions they craved. Contract negotiations moved fast once money was involved. Argon wired funds for development, offered lab space under a non-disclosure that smelled faintly of hubris, and assigned a small, eager team to my project. They thought they were buying innovation. They were buying leverage. Leverage is a curious thing. It can be used to crush or to catalyze. I used Argon to do both. With their money and access to industrial-grade fabrication, Project Revenant shed the ragged edges it had worn for months in the storage unit. The radiator plates were milled to spec, the containment coils were wound with a precision I couldn't have afforded alone. For the first time since Helix stole my work, I had industrial-level resources under my control, resources that had once belonged to the architects of my ruin. But I didn't hand Argon the whole truth. I fed them a version of the design that worked beautifully under controlled lab conditions, performance numbers that made investors salivate, while keeping the core stabilizer algorithm, the part that lived like a muscle memory in my hands, closed inside a vault of encrypted drives in my skull. Argon became my unwitting patron, polishing the shell of my invention so the world would believe their backing validated it. The moral complexities gnawed at me on quiet nights. Argon was innocent in the old-fashioned way, ambitious, a little reckless, but not cruel. I told myself that using them was no different from using Helix's hubris against itself. The calculus felt tidy when I whispered it in the dark: Argon would not pay for destruction. They would pay me to compete, to elevate, to unseat. In the end, their funds would amplify my justice. There were practical delights, too. Argon's legal team was brilliant but complacent. Their engineers were talented but inexperienced with the kind of improvisation my stabilizer demanded. I coached them like a parent coaching an apprentice, offering gentle corrections that made my work stronger without exposing the secret. They trusted Rex. They trusted numbers. Numbers are obedient when you write them. And I learned to enjoy the theater of it all. I watched as Argonne paraded our collaboration in closed investor dinners, as their PR drafted language that framed Rex Vollen as a visionary partner. I gave interviews through carefully curated proxies, letting the hype build until the market began to whisper that Argonne, not Helix, might own the future. Most deliciously, Helix noticed. Small things started showing up in their investor memos, mentions of market entrants, offhand comments in interviews, a tightening in tone. Victor Hale began to look over his shoulder at conferences. He couldn't know that Argonne was merely the instrument, that the hand guiding the instrument lived in shadows and solder burns. He only knew the competition was closing in, and that fear corrodes even the cleanest suits. I used Argonne to widen the battlefield. Their legitimacy opened doors I could never approach as a discredited employee. Their labs gave me plausible deniability and real-world scale. Their money bought me time and safety and the luxury of choice. When the day came to pull the last stitch, it would not be a lone man in a storage unit against a corporation. It would be a manufactured rivalry between giants, played exactly how I wanted. Still, I kept watching Victor Hale on television. His smile had the brittle quality of a man who thinks weather can be controlled. Argonne produced glossy schematics, Helix produced headlines. Both would make mistakes. Both had egos. Both were brittle in ways only an insider could exploit. On the day I signed the last documents as Rex Vollen, I felt a familiar sensation, the lightheaded thrill of standing on the edge of a cliff, only this time with a parachute made of blueprints and patience. The silence that followed the pen on paper was not empty. It hummed with possibility. Argonne had the labs. I had the secret. Helix had the arrogance. It was the perfect triangle. I tucked the encrypted drives into a hidden compartment of my car and walked out of Argonne's facility with the air of a man who had merely done business. Inside, Project Revenant slept under industrial lights, its components humming softly like a captive animal. Outside, the world continued to orbit its illusions. Soon, they would all orbit the same catastrophe. All I had to do was finish the choreography. It was a perfect morning, which, in hindsight, felt like nature mocking them. Blue skies. Cameras gleaming. Banners rippling with Helix's slogan, powering tomorrow, today. Tomorrow was about to burn. I watched the event unfold from a rooftop across the street, dressed in the quiet anonymity of a maintenance worker. A pair of tinted glasses hid my eyes from the world, and the world from my fury. Across the plaza, Helix's headquarters had been transformed into a cathedral of self-worship. A massive stage, a crowd of investors, engineers, and journalists. At the center stood Victor Hale, immaculate in his tailored suit, his arrogance shining brighter than the morning sun. The Helion engine prototype, my stolen creation, stood behind him on a polished steel platform, encased in transparent shielding like a holy relic. Hale placed his hand on it as if he were blessing a saint. Cameras flashed. The crowd roared. He began his speech, all buzzwords and self-congratulation. Helix Dynamics has always been about innovation, about courage, about the human spirit. I tuned out the noise and focused on the system feed running on my tablet. The code I had embedded into Helix's diagnostics weeks ago was active, invisible, and patient. It waited only for this moment, this sequence of activation commands. At exactly 10:17 a.m., the system would interpret Hale's demonstration command as normal. But under the hood, a delayed feedback loop would trigger, subtle, elegant, devastating. Not an explosion. Not chaos. Something far worse. Humiliation. I had engineered the reactor's containment fields to oscillate just slightly out of sync. Enough to disrupt readings, cause visible instability, and force a total system shutdown. No harm to anyone, but enough to make the world see that Helix's crown jewel was a fraud. I sipped my coffee and checked my watch. 10:16. Hale's voice thundered across the plaza. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the future of clean energy. He pressed the activation switch. The crowd held its breath. For 3 seconds, the machine hummed to life. The monitors displayed perfect metrics. Applause erupted, then froze. The readings began to fluctuate. Temperature spikes. Pressure drops. Red alerts. Engineers rushed onto the stage. Hale tried to laugh it off, still smiling, still pretending control. But the oscillations grew visible. The shielding flickered. The hum deepened into a metallic groan, like something ancient waking up. And then, with a sound like a sigh, the entire system shut down. The monitors went black. The lights flickered. Silence, long, heavy, and surgical. The crowd murmured. Someone shouted, "Is this part of the demo?" Cameras zoomed in, reporters whispered into microphones. Helix staff scrambled behind the stage. Hale's smile vanished, replaced by something raw and human: fear. I could almost hear his heartbeat over the static. Then came the whispers, first inside the crowd, then online, spreading faster than fire. It failed. The Helion engine failed. By noon, headlines flooded the web: Helix catastrophe, billion-dollar reactor shuts down mid-demo. By 3 p.m., Helix stock had dropped 17%. By sunset, 23%. And by nightfall, internal leaks, the ones I'd planted months earlier, began surfacing in forums and investor channels: falsified data, manipulated test results, inflated projections. All discovered by anonymous insiders. I didn't need to touch a thing. The system devoured itself. From my rooftop, I watched chaos bloom: reporters swarming, executives arguing, Hale barking into his phone. The machine behind him, inert and silent, was a monument to their arrogance. I allowed myself a small smile. Not joy, something colder. Satisfaction with a taste of justice. But then, something unexpected happened. The prototype, still dormant, flickered once, as though recognizing me across the distance. It was only a reflection from a camera flash, but it felt poetic. The ghost of my creation acknowledging its true maker. As the crowd scattered and the broadcast cut away, I whispered to no one. "This is the sound of your empire breaking." That night, I returned to my warehouse, my sanctuary, and opened a secure channel to Argonne. I uploaded the real prototype data: clean, perfected, stable. The opposite of the disaster the world had just witnessed. Argonne's executives, gleaming with opportunity, scheduled a press conference for the following week. They would unveil my true invention, under their name, of course, but this time, my name would not be erased. Helix had just buried itself. And the world didn't even realize whose hand held the shovel. The night after the collapse, Helix's headquarters glowed like a crime scene. Floodlights, security vans, glass shards of reputation scattered across the plaza. Reporters camped on the sidewalks, microphones stabbing at every executive who dared to step outside. The morning news had renamed the event Helix's $2 billion breakdown. They thought it was a glitch. They were wrong. It was a confession, they just hadn't realized who was speaking. While Victor Hale barked orders and PR teams scrambled to craft a narrative, I sat in the corner of my warehouse, watching the chaos through 5 different live streams. My laptop's fan whined with exhaustion as headlines multiplied like cells under a microscope. Then came the perfect moment, noise drowning out truth, the ideal time to see the real story. Weeks before, I'd prepared a dossier, over 200 pages of internal memos, patent manipulation records, falsified test results, and silenced whistleblower accounts, all real, all retrieved from Helix's systems during my months as a ghost. I'd also written a single, devastating line at the top. Innovation dies when thieves wear lab coats. That line would become a legend. At midnight, I uploaded the dossier through a web of proxies to 6 investigative journalists, reputable ones, the kind who don't ignore blood when it spills on polished shoes. Within hours, the files detonated across the internet. Whistleblower leaks expose Helix patent fraud. Evidence suggests invention theft, data falsification, and IP manipulation. Anonymous source claims Helix buried original inventor. The world loves a fallen hero more than a rising one. Helix had built an empire on the illusion of moral brilliance. Now the mask was gone, and beneath it was greed, cruelty, and fear. Helix went silent at first, corporate panic disguised as internal review. But silence is gasoline when the world smells scandal. Shareholders demanded answers. Government agencies opened investigations. Partner companies froze collaborations. And then someone leaked my name. Not Elias Rowan, that name was still buried. The leak referred to the whistleblower only as the engineer. No photo. No background. Just fragments of my old language, pieces of equations quoted from my notebooks, floating across headlines. The myth of the nameless creator spread like wildfire. Social media turned me into a ghost genius, a betrayed visionary reclaiming justice from the shadows. Memes, podcasts, op-eds, all asking the same question. Who is the engineer? Meanwhile, inside Helix, panic fermented into paranoia. Executives turned on one another. A senior lab director resigned live on a business broadcast, eyes wild, voice trembling. "We were told to file patents that weren't ours," she said. We were told to bury the real work. Helix's board responded by firing her. It didn't matter, the damage was done. The truth had momentum now. And truth, once it starts moving, doesn't stop for the powerful. By the end of the week, regulators raided Helix's offices. By the end of the month, Victor Hale was under investigation for intellectual property theft, securities fraud, and falsifying patent documents. Argonne, my so-called silent partner, capitalized immediately. They held a press conference announcing their new energy system, a clean, efficient, stable device built from the ground up. They didn't name the source of the technology, but their statement included one subtle, deliberate phrase that made my pulse quicken. Our innovation is inspired by an inventor the world tried to forget. That was my signature, hidden in plain sight. The world cheered for Argonne, for the faceless engineer, for justice finally aligning with profit. But I didn't cheer. I just watched. Because revenge, once set in motion, has gravity. It pulls everything toward its center, even the one who unleashed it. I had brought Helix to its knees. But Hale wasn't finished yet. Men like him don't surrender, they rot standing up. I knew the next move would be his. And I was ready to watch him choke on it. The day my name returned to the world, it didn't arrive in headlines or lawsuits, it came in whispers, then thunder. It began with a message from Argonne's communications director. Elias, she wrote, using the name I hadn't heard in over a year. We think it's time the world knows who you are. For a long time, I just stared at that sentence. It looked foreign, like a word I used to believe in but forgot how to pronounce. Argonne wanted to host a public unveiling of their new prototype, my perfected design, the one I'd rebuilt from ashes. They wanted me on stage. No masks, no aliases. The engineer, revealed. I almost refused. I'd lived too long as a ghost, the idea of being visible again felt dangerous, even sacrilegious. But then I remembered the conference room where they'd laughed at me, the smirk on Hale's face when he stole my future. And I realized visibility wasn't vulnerability, it was vengeance. So I said yes. The auditorium was smaller than Helix's grand halls, but it felt heavier, like truth had weight. Reporters lined the aisles, cameras blinking like restless eyes. When Argonne's CEO introduced me, the world saw a man they didn't recognize but somehow already knew. I walked on stage to a silence so complete I could hear the sound of my own pulse. Behind me, the real reactor, Project Revenant, gleamed softly under the lights. Compact. Silent. Alive. I spoke plainly, without theatrics. I built this because I believed innovation should serve humanity, not vanity. They took it from me. They called it theirs. And now, I take it back, not through theft, but through truth. Every word echoed like a wound finally healing. Then came the demonstration. I powered up Revenant. The hum was steady, clean, perfect, the kind of sound that makes engineers cry because it shouldn't exist, and yet it does. The energy readouts held stable, flawless. The journalists erupted. Cameras flashed. Investors whispered. But for me, it was quiet. Peaceful. Because for the first time, I was standing inside my own story again. Argonne's stock soared. Within hours, they eclipsed Helix's valuation. The same investors who once called my invention a fantasy now begged for a seat at the table. The irony was so thick it almost felt like mercy. But I wasn't finished yet. The following morning, I released a statement under my own name, the first in years. I didn't accuse. I didn't gloat. I simply showed receipts, dated schematics, time-stamped prototypes, internal emails. I laid bare the theft in daylight so bright it burned through every lie Helix had built. The world didn't need outrage, it needed evidence. And I gave it in abundance. By evening, Elias Rowan was trending across every platform. Some called me the ghost inventor. Others, the revenant engineer. But my favorite headline was simple. The man who took his future back. Helix's remaining executives issued a statement of denial, weak, bloodless. Victor Hale didn't appear in public. The board suspended operations pending investigation. Their empire, once untouchable, now hung from the noose of truth. Argonne offered me a full division under my leadership, my own team, my own name on every document. They called it the Rowan Initiative. I didn't smile. Not right away. Because revenge, even justified, leaves residue, the faint echo of what it cost. But as I stood in that new lab, surrounded by engineers who actually listened, I felt something I hadn't in years, purpose without pain. I wasn't their ghost anymore. I was their blueprint. And somewhere in the ruins of Helix, Victor Hale was watching. I knew, because he'd always watched me, first with arrogance, now with dread. He'd taken my past. I had taken his present. But the best part was yet to come. Poetic justice has a sound. For me, it was the hollow echo of footsteps through the deserted lobby of Helix Dynamics, the empire that once owned my name, now gutted by truth and auction signs. I hadn't planned to return there. But when the notice of liquidation went public, I couldn't resist. Argonne had won the bid for several of Helix's assets, mostly patents and lab equipment. They asked if I wanted to oversee the acquisition. I said yes. The building looked smaller than I remembered. The marble floors still gleamed, but there was dust on everything, the kind that settles after applause ends. The giant Helix logo behind the reception desk had been dismantled, leaving faint screw holes in the wall like scars. And then I saw him. Victor Hale. Older. Thinner. The brilliance gone from his eyes, replaced by that particular vacancy men wear when they finally realize the world has moved on without them. He was packing the last of his things into a box, a nameplate, a watch, a photo of his family smiling before they understood what kind of man he was. He didn't recognize me at first. Maybe he couldn't believe the ghost had come back wearing a tailored suit and calm eyes. "Mr. Hale," I said softly. "You left something unfinished." His mouth opened, but no words came out. The silence between us was heavy, the kind forged in betrayal and consequence. "I came to make sure you understood," I continued. "You didn't lose a company. You lost a mirror. Everything you stole was only a reflection of someone else's brilliance." He finally found his voice. "You think you won?" he rasped. "You ruined your own creation out of spite." I smiled, not cruelly, but truthfully. "No. I saved it. The world deserved to see what real innovation looks like, and who actually builds it." He tried to hold my gaze, but his pride was brittle now. He looked down at the floor, muttered something about lawyers, justice, fairness. The usual excuses of a fallen king. I leaned closer. "You once told me my ideas were worthless," I said. "That I didn't understand business. But tell me, Victor, how's the business of humiliation treating you?" His hand tightened around his box of belongings. I almost felt pity. Almost. Then I remembered the rain that night I was locked out. The laughter. The word fantasy echoing in my ears as my dream was stolen. Pity is for those who don't know what it's like to be erased. As I turned to leave, I said the last words I would ever speak to him. "I told you it worked." Outside, the air was sharp with autumn. Reporters lingered by the gates, snapping photos of the fallen CEO. Behind them, banners for the Rowan Initiative fluttered proudly in the wind, the new face of innovation. My face. Helix had collapsed. Argonne had ascended. The world had moved on. But I didn't stay for the applause or the wealth or even the redemption. I stayed because revenge, real revenge, isn't about destruction. It's about balance. About standing where you once fell and realizing you are no longer afraid. I built something new from what they tried to bury. I became the man they said I'd never be. And when I look at the skyline now, I don't see their empire anymore. I see mine.